Hello, good morning. It's so great to be here today. My name is Natalie Rawi, the Health Equity and Resilience Manager at the World Green Building Council, and thank you to the Capacity Building Hub for hosting us today. Just a quick agenda. We're going to go through a brief introduction and setting the stage for financing a resilient future. We're going to go into a deep dive of the panel discussion and potentially have a short breakout discussion amongst you to get a better sense of where you're at in this topic, and then we'll close out briefly. So just to get us started, the World Green Building Council is the largest and most influential action network accelerating the sustainable and just transition of the built environment. We represent a global community of over 75 green building councils and their 48,000 members around the world. Together, we drive local action to create an impact on a global scale. We do this in alignment with the ambitions of the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. What unites us is our shared commitment to resilient and decarbonized buildings for a healthy planet and a better future for all. Because while the built environment, where we live, work, and interact, is essential for human life, these structures are now the cause of and being impacted by climate change. So just to survey the sector, right now the buildings and construction sector is one of the biggest emitters on the planet. Globally, it's responsible for 37% of energy-related carbon emissions, 34% of energy demand, and 40 to 50% of raw material use. As well, unfortunately, the sector cannot be downsized, as we need to house 2 billion additional homes in the next 75 years, and 80% of cities lack affordable housing for their citizens. So how do we make buildings the solution? The buildings and construction sector can become the built and is possible to use, can be, for people, it provides 200 million jobs worldwide and accounts for 11 to 13% of the global GDP. For economies, it is 30% in green growth possibilities and accounting for 4.5 trillion in US economic benefits. As well, in working together, we can enable ambitious, equitable policies and equip finance actors to deploy impactful capital and help to slow down resource decline, recover biodiversity, and help us preserve our limited resources. At the World Green Building Council, we are looking towards building to our three common goals: the total decarbonization of the built environment, healthy, equitable, resilient buildings, cities, and communities, and the regeneration of natural systems and a thriving circular economy. To achieve these, the World Green Building Council network is uniquely placed to drive ambition and foster alignment and collaboration among governments, businesses, and communities. Our network covers 60% of the world's building stock and 65% of global GDP. With the countries represented by our network accounting for 72% of built environment emissions, this presents a huge potential to lead the reduction of the global impact of our industry and inspire regenerative circular business models. Our national GBCs can influence over 38,000 members, ranging from private sector businesses to national and local governments, academic institutions, private individuals, and many more. In this way, the World Green Building Council can be a bridge between the built environment, policymakers, and the finance sector, acting as a universal translator, providing standards and frameworks that financial institutions can use to better assess and manage climate-related risks in the built environment. In recent years, we've seen the built environment increasing in the international political agenda, starting with the launch of a Built Environment Day at COP26 in Glasgow. We've seen this translate into 2 multinational agreements in the past 12 months. The Buildings Breakthrough at COP28, which calls for near-zero emission and resilient buildings to be the new normal by 2030, and is now supported by 28 countries. We are proud to be leading on Priority Action 1 of the Buildings Breakthrough on standards and certifications alongside the Global ABC, as well as the Buildings and Climate Global Forum in Paris earlier this year, which concluded with a Declaration de Chaillot, adopted by representatives of 70 countries, agreeing to international cooperation to enable progress towards a rapid, fair, and effective transition of the sector. And all this is important because we know that presently, the building sector is insufficiently resilient to the impacts of climate change. Building resilience must be improved to protect people from heat waves, droughts, coastal flooding, and sea level rise, cyclones, strong winds, and the cold. Built environments account for 2/3 of global real estate assets, posing serious risks to our global economy. The insurance industry is already facing major losses from climate change. Natural catastrophe events have led to 3.6 times increase in insured losses over the last 30 years, and global insurance losses from natural catastrophes have exceeded 100 billion annually in the last few years. Investing in more resilient infrastructure could save humanity 4.2 trillion from climate change damages, according to the World Bank. At this year's COP, a new climate finance goal, known as the New Collective Quantified Goal, or the NCQG, will be adopted. It is largely informed by NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, in which buildings are often overlooked. The NCQG offers an opportunity to tackle many of the financial barriers blocking the transition to sustainable built environments and to reduce the cost of inaction. However, the NCQG is largely informed by NDCs, in which buildings are often overlooked. As you know, countries will next year be setting out their updated carbon goals, and they need to submit revised nationally determined contribution statements. NDCs will dominate the climate conversation next year, and Brazil has said their presidency will see them have a laser focus on NDCs. An NDC that delivers a 1.5-degree aligned pathway for our world is not possible unless it includes strong commitments supported by action for the building sector. So that's why we are calling on governments to be bold on buildings in their climate plans and national policies. And our efforts here are not only focused on campaigning, but also concrete support and capacity building that can scale solutions we know exist. With the NDC Scorecard project, we are co-creating a tool with our GBCs that will surface the best practice policy measures that should be included in NDCs. And true to the values of our global, regional, local approach, we will be developing this in collaboration with our green building councils and bringing local solutions that we know work to a global conversation. This tool will highlight a suite of best practice policy measures that governments should be committed to in their NDCs. This means the best practice measures covering energy, efficiency, embodied emissions, electrification, and resilience in the built environment, among others. And crucially, it will allow governments and stakeholders to analyze how both their NDC and national policies are aligned with these practice measures and highlight where gaps exist. To further build capacity, we have also been working to develop our Zero Carbon and Climate Resilience Readiness Framework. It is a regional project that provides the first steps towards decarbonizing the built environment and achieving energy-efficient and resilient buildings. It is being developed alongside the Green Building Councils in our global network and their partners to provide locally relevant solution, and is currently being piloted by our regional networks in MENA, Asia Pacific, and the Americas to define enabling actions that each country and the region need to prepare for the development of national roadmaps for decarbonization and resilience in the built environment. Developing them has been a real collaborative process, involving stakeholders up and down the value chain and from around the regions. It is going to provide a firm foundation for every nation in the region to build its own ambitious 1.5 roadmap, meaning that countries don't have to start drawing up a roadmap from scratch. They'll have a framework to work from. As well, the World GBC is working on a series of flagship miniature publications to highlight the leadership and industry best practice in relevant topics to build capacity and accelerate the transition to decarbonized and resilient built environments. Reach out if you'd like to learn more or get involved. We're here today to talk about financing a resilient future. At this year's COP, World GBC and the Green Building Council Network are calling on governments to commit to actions for the built environment so we can enable increased action through climate finance and strengthen resilience with adaptation planning. We look forward to exploring this further in the discussion. Thank you. And now I'd like to invite to the stage our panelists, Audrey Nugent, who is our Global Advocacy and Campaigns Director. In this role, Audley leads on global advocacy and campaigns, collaborating with green building councils around the world to champion ambitious and innovative public policies. She's passionate about a holistic approach to building policy and regulation can support the delivery of the Paris Agreement, whilst leading to better outcomes for people and communities. She has over 15 years' experience working in policy and advocacy and has worked across private and public and the NGO sector. Welcome, Audrey. Next, I'd like to invite Simon McWhirter. He is the UK Green Building Council's Deputy Chief Executive, where he leads the political and international climate work, as well as overseeing the corporate communications with members, media, and the wider industry. He also has oversight of UK GBC's portfolio or place-based projects and has developed and developed activity, including heading up the UK GBC Scotland. Aligned to this, Simon sits on a variety of fora, including the UK government's Green Construction Board, and is a director on the UK's National Retrofit Hub and Scotland's Built Environment Smarter Transformation. He has a master's degree in law from Oxford University and international and economic business law from Kyushu University, Japan. He brings almost 30 years of experience in communication, business development, industry, and policy advocacy to his UK GBC role, having held a wide range of roles spanning across the construction, finance, and not-for-profit sectors. Welcome, Simon. Next, I'd like to invite Gregory Carley. He is an executive advisor and leads the sustainability, resilience, and ESG practice within the GHD's advisory team. Mr. Carley oversees the strategic integration of sustainability and resilience principles into a broad range of client solutions across GHD's market segments of water, transportation, environment, property, and buildings, and energy. Mr. Carley's focus includes ESG integration, climate risk management, and sustainable infrastructure. He brings over 25 years of experience providing innovative solutions to clients with a particular focus on helping clients realize the commercial value of their sustainability program. Welcome, Greg. And last but not least, I'd like to invite Darius Nasri. Darius is a vice president with the climate finance team at WSP. He has experience in program design and implementation, sustainable infrastructure, transition finance, clean technology, carbon markets, and strategy development and implementation. At WSP, he co-chairs the Climate Change and Insurance Working Group. He supports clients with their climate and decarbonization strategies. Building on his experience with the ARPAE RMI Overseas Development Institute, ODI, and the Center for Global Development, the CGD, Global Green Growth Institute, the GGGI, the Norwegian Investment Fund for Developing Countries, the Norfund, and Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC. Earlier in his career, he worked as an investment banker in the energy and utilities sector in New York, London, and Tokyo. He has lived and worked in the US, UK, Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Carleton College and a Master in Public Affairs degree from Princeton University. Welcome, Darius. And welcome all. It is so great to have you here, and I look forward to this insightful discussion. I will now join you. Hello. Hi, good morning. If you'd all just like to take a second or two to introduce yourselves and share some thoughts on your role and what brings you to this conversation today. Audrey, you can go first, just
okay.
Hello.
You've already done a great introduction, but I'm Audrey, Director of Global Advocacy at the World Green Building Council. So my role is to work with the network we have of Green Building Councils, 75 plus Green Building Councils around the world, to facilitate conversations and drive action and advocacy and policy, and specifically to the project that Natalie was talking about. Currently focusing on the role of the building sector in NDCs and calling for governments and industry to be bold on buildings, but also working on something called the Buildings Breakthrough, which many of you may be aware of, which is a initiative which is led by France and Morocco to focus on a goal of making near zero emissions and resilient buildings the new normal. So excited to kind of hear some examples today about what we can do to make that a reality, particularly on the side of resilience. But I can say more later. So
Thank you, Audrey. Simon, if you'd like to just do a brief intro.
Yeah, cheers. It's really good to be doing this actually in the capacity building hub with the real focus on knowledge sharing and exchange. I think when we come on to the detail of the discussion today, certainly in a UK context and in a lot of Europe, one of the biggest problems when we're thinking about driving real progress in the adaptation and resilience spaces, there's not a lot of knowledge in the sector, and it's quite tightly held in the places where it does exist. So it's really good that it's very appropriate we're having this discussion here. So as was said, I lead our policy political work at a national and international level, and I guess one of my key roles in the organisation is trying to help support us to build bridges between the political policy frameworks, the business behaviours and the financial flows that get all these things moving and hopefully drive real progress. So yeah, looking forward to the chat.
Thank you, Simon. Greg, if you'd like to go.
Thank you, Natalie. And it's a great pleasure to be here with this panel in the Capacity Building Hub this morning. So I lead our sustainability practice at GHD, and GHD is a global professional services and engineering firm. And what we really focus on is bridging that gap between sustainability ambition and our private sector, public sector, communities, cities that we work with, and helping them actualize their goals and move that forward using sound engineering approaches and really focusing on the technical side and how we move the needle for them to address some of the biggest issues they have around climate change.
Thank you, Greg. Darius.
Thank you, Natalie, and thanks to the host for this panel and event. I'm Darius Nassiri, Vice President with the Climate Finance Team at WSP based in the US. Our firm has over 73,000 experts who work in 50 countries and 500 offices worldwide. We have a strong sustainability and ESG commitment, and my practice area focuses on both the economic risks to the physical environment, including the built environment, as well as financing solutions to invest in greater adaptation resilience. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you. And thank you all for joining us for this conversation. And as we've seen, in order to advance the NCQG, the nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs, are key here. And so my question to you, Audrey, is how can these nationally determined contributions be effectively aligned with local roadmaps to enhance climate resilience in the built environment? As well, what role should financial actors play in this alignment?
Great. I think at COP, I've only been here for a day, but I've noticed already that there's so much focus and conversations that are taking place about the role of NDCs. And as you've already said, the current trajectory of NDCs that have been submitted by government is going to put us on track to between 2.5 and 2.9 degrees of global warming, which we all know is pretty catastrophic for the planet. So there's a real need for the NDCs that are being put forward by governments to be aligned with a 1.5 degree trajectory. And if that's going to happen, it really needs to, a couple of different things need to happen. First of all, we need to have sector specific commitments in those, and we need to have them for buildings. They need to be co-created, I think, with industry. So industry need to be at the table, having conversations with governments on how these NDCs can become investable and how they're setting out a long-term trajectory and investment plan that, that gives that certainty. And I think that's really important. And I think at the moment when we're talking about, climate change, the focus a lot of the time is on mitigation. So we need to be ensuring that we're treating the in an equitable way, both mitigation and resilience and adaptation. Because especially what we've seen in recent months in many regions around the world is that there might be a bit of a disconnect, and we need to figure out what role the built environment is playing in driving the resilience agenda. And as Simon says, moving it from certain pockets of information and scaling that and making sure that that's available. And I think what the work that we're trying to do with the NDCs is create a kind of link between what we're seeing at ambition at the high level, so that you have an NDC and it says it's going to do X, Y, and Z. That's fantastic. But are those measures that you're saying you're going to put forward in your NDC, are they being translated into your local policies? Are they being translated into city level policies, and who's actually taking action to implement them? And that's what's so fantastic about the network that we have at World Green Building Council, is because we're able to facilitate that global, regional, local model. So Simon, who sits beside me, leads the UK Green Building Council's work in that area. And they're a very good example of, a Green Building Council who's addressing these global challenges and actually driving that change locally. And that's what I'm hoping we can do with the NDCs.
Thank you, Audrey. And Simon, the next question goes to you then. How has this started to look like at the local level? I know you've done some great work with the UK GBC's Resilient Roadmap, so maybe you can share some insights on the process and how that's starting to come together and bringing this conversation forward.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Audrey's stat on 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming, frankly, terrifies me. And I think, especially in the UK, at a macro level, our response capability to the warmer, wetter climate we've got coming down the track with much more unpredictable weather events, we are woefully unprepared in the UK. Our previous chief exec of the Committee for Climate Change called adaptation in the UK the Cinderella of climate change, in that it's sort of unloved, sitting in the corner, underfunded and under-resourced. And unfortunately, that's very much the case, but obviously done properly, the built environment can do a lot of the heavy lifting in getting the country ready for that greater level of resilience that it's going to need. But there is that really low level of knowledge penetration in the market. I think a couple of years ago, working with World GBC and a range of other green building councils across Europe, we developed a whole life carbon roadmap for the UK's built environment, saying how do we get to net zero by 2050? And that mapped out all the policy decisions and movements we needed, and it also mapped out the industry behaviours to get us there. We've just spent the last year doing the same thing, working in a really collaborative way, data-driven, evidence-based, working with our membership across the country to say, what does that look like for the built environment in 2050 from an adaptation and a resilience perspective? What does a UK built environment look like that's ready for that future? We tried to do that both at the national framework level and also at a really hyper-local level. And I think that twin approach is absolutely key between looking at the whole life carbon picture and the resilience picture when we look at the buildings breakthrough that Audrey's mentioned, where that target of near zero and resilient buildings being the new normal by 2030, that is a really tough hill to climb to get us there. And what we've done with the carbon resilience roadmap for the UK is it had to really start from back to basics. We had to focus on a range of layered activities in building that roadmap up. First being just building awareness of what adaptation is, what it means in a UK context, building those level of understandings, identifying the metrics that we need to use to better understand it, quantify it, and quantify what the direction of travel needs to be and how we know if we're getting there. And actually building a real sense of urgency and developing plans and tools for stakeholders in the UK's built environment to get there. I'll come back to some of that detail in a moment, but I guess the wraparound I would say is we've had to sort of take a systems change approach to that. When we're looking at adaptation, it's a really careful blend of needing national frameworks for action with really hyper-local responses. Adaptation, whether that's overheating or flood response or drought, is a local response on the ground. So for instance, in terms of tools that we've developed, we've done a very detailed GIS map of the country, which does two primary things, I guess. It says which areas of the country are at most risk from certain extreme weather events, be that flood or overheating issues. And then what it actually then does is say, and what does the vulnerability of the people on the ground look like there? Is that particularly bad thing going to target one of our most vulnerable communities? Because unfortunately, what we see, not just in the UK context, but on a global basis, unfortunately, our most vulnerable communities around the planet are most at risk from extreme climate events. So what the roadmap tries to do is play that bridge in from the political space to the business space, setting out the pathway of what are the regs we need, what way does business need to change, how do we protect people over the ground for the changes coming down the track.
Thank you so much, Simon. And Greg, just to build off of that, how have you seen organizations successfully manage and overcome some of these challenges, especially when it comes to resilience and adaptation financing?
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. And just, building off of Audrey's and Simon's comments, it is really, when we're talking about cities, and we work with cities all the time, they're at the front lines of climate change. They're the ones dealing with it day in, day out in their operations. GHD did some research earlier this year where we talked to about 10,000 people globally. The top concerns and worries were related to our collective ability to withstand climate change, extreme weather events, and the environmental damage. It's consistent across the globe. It's everywhere, and it's really is the challenges. It comes to that local community level. What we see with clients is that cities and governments are so busy dealing with the day-to-day in response to those issues, whether a flood or a wildfire, that they often have a gap in looking at that forward-looking resiliency. Most of that recovery is funded through disaster relief. I think you had a number of saving 4.2 trillion up there, Natalie. I think I saw a stat that we spend about 3.1 trillion a year in that way. It doesn't matter, it's a big number. is really all that matters. But I think there's a real opportunity when we're rebuilding that infrastructure to have a more forward-looking thinking. But it's really hard when you're facing, such as in North Carolina this year with mudslides and rain events or wildfires in California. It's really hard to have that forward-looking view when you're trying to deal with the here and now and people's lives, particularly, as you were saying, Simon, some of our most vulnerable people. So it's really about breaking that cycle and having that ability to do that. And I think there's some planning issues we can look at in how we are able to be more forward-looking and deal with some of those resiliency and infrastructure sooner. It's often disrepair and it needs to be done now. And how do we take something forward? So it's simple things like, when we look at wastewater treatment plants, how do we turn those into energy vehicles through capturing the energy that they have and things like that. But it really comes to, and we're talking about financing, the role of both the private and public sector in this. Public sector often has the access to capital to do these things, but it's the operating that can be a real challenge of some of these resilient infrastructures. I think there's a strong role for the public sector or the private sector to be doing that part, but we need some certainty. And I've heard a few times here in the day or so I've been at COP around providing that certainty for business to act. They will act when there's certainty, but when there's policy changes or things happening and uncertainty, businesses don't want to invest. But when we have policy that has that long-term view, I think businesses will invest, and that's really part of the solution as well.
Thank you so much. And yes, in terms of certainty and just thinking about financial actors as well, to Darius, I ask, what have you seen being the key challenges to financing resilience, and perhaps what innovative financing mechanisms could support adaptation projects, and how do we incentivize investors to leverage them?
Thanks very much, Natalie. And picking up on the points that have been raised earlier, I can only agree with Greg and Simon and Audrey in characterizing the world we live in as increasingly uncertain and unfortunately sometimes absent or without the policy framework that businesses sometimes need. We see that as well in the government side. We developed at WSP a database of federal funding opportunities, over $1 trillion of money from the Inflation Reduction Act and other legislation made available to states and local communities, cities, to invest in climate mitigation and adaptation. And exactly to Greg's point, we see that oftentimes city planners and state decision makers lack the budget processes to get ahead of resilience investment choices and take advantage of the funding that's available. So it's not only a matter of funding available or even information, but planning processes that need to be modified and reformed. In addition, I think there is hope for improved building codes and standards. I appreciate what Audrey said about the next round of NDCs. We at WSP have been doing work on developing national transition plans and the concept of a climate investment prospectus for countries and even subnational entities to develop proposals to the investor community to see what investments are available in those jurisdictions to make investments in mitigation and adaptation in the way the finance sector expects to see, building from the NDCs and national transition plans that will be submitted next year. And in addition, there are new technologies that become available in this less certain world that can help us cope with the new risks we face. For example, we've all seen the growth of parametric insurance as a means by which communities can cope with disasters when the wind is strong enough to trigger a payout. We now have technologies that allow us to forecast extreme weather events. And we've been doing work on forecast-based insurance that allows communities in developed countries as well as developing countries to receive payments in advance of a disaster so that they can prepare themselves and equip themselves with resilience investments. Sometimes that may even mean moving from communities in advance of that extreme weather event, as we've seen in some African countries, based on predictions. So I think we live in a new world, and we need to begin to innovate solutions transcending the existing processes of decision-making and funding, and begin to recognize that this is a different environment we're going to live in and operate in. Otherwise, we will see as Greg mentioned, the catastrophic impacts of climate change washing away physical structures, as we saw tragically in North Carolina.
Yes, thank you so much, Darius. And just to build off of that, I think one of the important things that we're thinking about here is data and how do we measure, because we can't really progress in the direction we can't measure. So just to ask Simon to start, but if anyone's got some contributions on what kind of specific metrics should we be prioritizing to create this meaningful impact and to incentivize this for financial investors as well as policymakers?
So I think just as a preamble to answer that, I think just thinking about Darius's point, my dad was an insurance broker, and I think the panic in his face if he was sitting here about the idea of prepaying insurance payouts. But it's absolutely spot on with the sort of intelligent financial instruments that we're going to need to tackle what's coming. The world is changing, and we need to be flexible in changing our response mechanisms, whether those are political, financial levers. The sort of climate-related metrics that we've had historically are just definitively much more geared around climate mitigation than adaptation. You know, we have better approaches around that. You know, generally they look at cost of impact and return on investment, things like that. And from a resilience perspective, that generally looks at where is the asset and what is its level of exposure. But we need a much more sophisticated set of thinking around this. And we've tried to embed that in the climate resilience roadmap that we've put out as UKGBC. And basically, the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, is a really good starting point for the metrics. It says, you know, are the decisions the metric leads you to useful? You know, will it help you understand the impacts of climate-related hazards? Are the metrics you're using clear and understandable? You know, can they be communicated easily to a wide range of stakeholders? You know, not necessarily just well-informed stakeholders operating in large-scale commercial real estate. You know, are the metrics reliable and verifiable and objective? And are they consistent over time? Have we got metrics where we can look at historical information, current information, future risk, and make intelligent decisions off that basis? But I guess that TCFD stuff is a really good starting point, but we need a second stage layered over that, which is what we're trying to do in the UK, which is say, do those metrics in and of themselves let us make decisions about meaningful impact? But as asset level metrics, they're really insufficient, and we need to broaden out what we're assessing in that sense. So for instance, if we're looking at a commercial real estate and saying, you know, assessing it with those metrics, are we also looking at what's happening in the surrounding environment when we're making a decision? Because if that house in a flood area is surrounded by non-permeable paving, it's a significantly different insurance risk as an asset than one that's surrounded by sustainable urban drainage, and able to cope with it. You know, or for instance, does an individual asset have the capability to respond? Does it have adaptive responses built in? So that might be flood resilience measures, or if you go to Japan, you know, they've got a whole range of buildings where, you know, you have tectonic gimbals built into the foundations so they can flex and move when they get quake tremors. You know, we need to just be thinking much more about localities and a wider set of things when we're assessing the metrics. That gives us the ability to paint a picture on true risk for what we need for the resilience embedded into the market.
Thank you, Simon. Does anyone on the panel have some thoughts to share as well?
Yeah, I'd like to build on that a little bit. I think it's also about using the data we have better. And I think you were commenting around some of the databases that you've created, but often the data is there. We're not fully extracting the value of that data, and I think that's a really important part of it. So a really simple example of that, City of Buffalo, New York, we've been doing some work there around lead pipes. So lead pipes are a major public health issue, and being able to replace those, in particular, the homeowner cost of that can be quite significant. So using advanced data, some data mining, some analytics, and really focusing around pairing up the communities where there's funding available to be able to do that, and then using some really innovative technologies to actually do the replacements. They were able to prioritize certain areas of Buffalo funding, that they could move faster and be able to complete a project like that the city was sitting there for years going, we have no way of funding this thing. So being able to use the data we have smarter and using techniques and analytics to do that is also a really important part of that, and paired up with some of the broader metric evaluations.
Thank you, Greg. Darius, have you got some thoughts to share?
Well, I'd like to respond. I think the point about forecast-based insurance is really early stage work. And I would highlight the value of both Greg and Simon's interventions with regard to the benefits of how we can see the world differently with technology today. We can take advantage of the new technologies that are available to us to look forward. The original purpose of TCFD was to telescope forward to the present some view of the future that allowed the reallocation of capital among financial decision makers. And that idea of being able to see forward into the future is baked into the scenario planning. That's a requirement part of TCFD, but is more generally applicable to decision making about the future. One of the features of a developed country versus a developing country, having lived in both types of economies, is the ability to plan longer term. And if we're going to cope with climate change, I think we should take advantage of every tool we have available to extend the time frame for planning and decision making to developing countries, emerging economies, and of course, industrialized countries as well. And that concept of extending the time frame for planning is deep inside the data analytics business, which is now experiencing a Cambrian explosion. It's hard to keep up with the various companies and startups that are exactly working in this space to try to look forward to the future and see what risks the built environment and other environments face. I think the second point I'd like to highlight is with regard to space itself. The systems approach that was highlighted is critical to understanding resilience. We are moving beyond, we have to move beyond an asset-centered approach and begin to think of the built environment in the social and natural context in which buildings are located. It's not enough to know that a building's first floor won't flood if the building is in a situation or a location where the power systems don't work, or other buildings are flooded and roads are flooded, or it's too hot to send people home even if you're safe in that particular location. So we can begin to think about systems as resilient rather than physical assets. And then finally, to the point on data itself, as we've developed this new economy of data analytics providers, we need to start thinking about how do we make sure that the most critical data is available to public sector decision makers. We have the potential now to build digital twins of cities and suburban locations where we can begin to assess the sustainability and resilience of those systems. And we need to take advantage of those tools, thinking beyond simple building codes and the metrics that might pop out of a TCFD or even CSRD requirement, and thinking into how do we measure the resilience of an entire system, and how do we equip decision makers with the data they need and the capacity they'll need to understand that data.
Thank you, Darius. And I think you sort of just articulated the question I would like to ask to Audrey. So how do we start to take this data from local impact to a global impact and start to influence policymakers at a large scale?
It's a tricky question. I think what I'm kind of reflecting on, and one of the things we talk about a lot is, you know, when we're talking about the NDCs, and also there's a conversation taking place at this COP about national adaptation plans, and sometimes just seeing kind of I don't even know if disconnect is the right word, but we've just heard some amazing examples of like innovations that are taking place, what industry needs, what industry can do, and how do you bring that to governments to say and encourage them to be ambitious as they're developing their adaptation plans, their NDCs, and yeah, exactly what type of data does industry have access to that they can share? And obviously there's all sorts of conversations that take place about data that I am not an expert on in terms of privacy, but there must be something there that can be shared and use that information intelligently so that we are getting the right types of plans when it comes to resilience and adaptation. And again, as well, how can, for example, the national adaptation plans facilitate finance flows, and how do we kind of bring all of that together? And it really just makes me all the more kind of like urgent about the fact that when we're developing these policies, it has to be done with industry at the table so that we're actually surfacing what's there, but also looking towards a longer term view. So not these kind of short term political cycles, but looking towards longer term what we need, and that triggering that certainty so that we can trigger that investment. I think that'll be really important.
Thank you, Audrey. Yes. And just to close things out, if there are some final thoughts or examples on how we can start to leverage this public-private effort and policymakers to advance resilience and adaptation financing in the built environment, I asked this question to the panel to see if anyone's got some final thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly. We've got a new government in the UK, a few months old. I'm trying not to be a political neophyte about this, but the winds are blowing in the right direction for us in the UK for the first time in a long time. And I think that's really important because what the finance and investment community want is real comfort and confidence that the political directionality is going to stay, and that they want to know and see that the public sector are engaging and investing in it, you know, so they can lead the market and seed that. And that we really feel that coming in the UK. So not wanting to put a naivety hat on, but you know, things are definitely moving in the right direction for us, and we're looking forward to some good outcomes from the UK.
And contrast that to the US right now, right? We're seeing a lot of uncertainty, a lot of chaos, and you know, people not knowing what's going to happen in the next 6, 12, 4 years, whatever it will be, which is inhibiting decision making and action. So it's the opposite effect. Hopefully that'll get some clarity soon and things will start to unlock, but you know, a lot of questions about where the U.S. goes next, right?
As the one of the Americans on the panel, I'll comment simply by saying that the comfort that business needs from policy stability, certainly we appreciate the leadership in the UK, and we notice that the leadership in the US has historically come from the states as well as cities. The state of California, where I grew up, has remained a climate leader through political cycles. There are also advisors to the incoming president who are based or have done significant amount of business in California. And I think that point of leadership should be noticed. It should also be underscored that the long-term stability in this space is not necessarily going to come from political leaders, as important as policy is, but rather from the North Star of climate physics. I think we should notice that the physics become the inevitable driver of decision making, and whether buildings made or retrofitted today, built today, are stranded in 20 or 30 years will have, to some extent, will depend on the degree to which the architects and planners recognize that the changing physics of the weather systems will dictate whether an asset is viable or less viable under those conditions. So I'd say focusing on the physics as the overriding point of reference will be necessary. My colleagues and I recently wrote a blog post on building codes and data on this topic, but I'd like to make one last point, and that is it's worth paying attention to what the young people are doing and what the startup sector is doing. This ties to California, of course, but it's global. And when you start noticing what the data analytics companies are doing, what the satellite companies are doing, and where young people are spending time coming up with new ideas, it is inspiring to see what's possible. And I think it's incumbent on those of us who have more than a couple of decades experience in this space to notice where the future capital flows are going and where young people are spending their time finding solutions. That is a source of inspiration and can also be the basis for sound policymaking in the future.
Yes, thank you so much, and I agree. I think there's a lot more innovation needed in this space, and it's going to need maybe new ways of thinking and new ways of doing to start to advance some of the old problems that we've been creating. So hopefully we'll get to hear more from the youth throughout this COP and moving forward. So thank you so much for that, Darius. Audrey, do you have some final thoughts to share?
No, I was just nodding and smiling and agreeing with Darius. I think it's nice to kind of hear that perspective and that point on, you know, leadership. And somebody was talking the other day about this idea of like distributed leadership. So, you know, people might be concerned about like the changing political winds in certain countries, but actually we need to ensure that we're all taking a leadership role, I think, in that. And that gave me some comfort, being slightly concerned about the trajectory for the planet, but I think that was nice.
Well, thank you so much. If there are any final thoughts, feel free to share. Otherwise, it was a pleasure having you. Thank you all for this insightful discussion, and thanks. Hope you have a great rest of your COP to everyone here. And yeah, have a great, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Ashley.
Thank you.
Before we close out, if there's anyone in the audience with any questions or some thoughts to share. No? All right, well, thank you again for joining us today, and yeah. All right, we're good. Thank you.